This story began a long time ago with the rescue of a little boy. The boy ran away with his sister and asked her to wait for their parents. The girl continued to run, trying to calm him down, even though she was in tears herself and said that their parents would definitely catch up with them. Hearing that their parents would catch up with them, the boy did not believe his sister. A huge tear rolled down from the inner corner of his eye and he turned to the girl. He saw that his parents, like many others, were lying face down on the ground. He asked if their parents were asleep and, if so, offered to wake them up. Suddenly, there was an explosion behind them and people with weapons were running nearby. They ran along with the other people and the little boy cried, calling for his parents and sister. He couldn't calm down. The girl promised to come back for his parents later, asked him to hold on tight so he wouldn't fall, and continued running. Two men with guns were watching them from an ambush. They fired bullets that hit everything around them. The girl crouched down on the ground and held the little boy close to her. The boy was scared, so he kept calling for his sister. The girl asked him not to be afraid, saying that she was holding him and he just needed to close his eyes. Suddenly, a guy appeared in front of them and managed to neutralize the two men sitting in ambush. The girl and the boy continued to sit on the ground. After clearing the way, he put down his weapon and asked if they were okay and hadn't been hurt. He told them to run away quickly because it was dangerous there. But the children remained where they were, and suddenly something in the sky caught their attention and that of their savior. They stared at it without looking away. They saw an airplane approaching them at tremendous speed. There was a red star painted on its tail and a huge red circle on its nose. The guy realized that the plane was going to attack and that they were in the line of fire. He rushed towards them, trying to save them, wanting to push them out of the way. The plane began firing at the ground. Explosions began to sound again. Fire flashed here and there, and spray of earth rose into the air and covered everyone. The boy found himself on the ground, sitting on all fours. He was barefoot and crying hard. He didn't know where his parents were, whether they would catch up with them, or what had happened to his sister. Suddenly, a crackling sound caught his attention. He turned his head and saw an iron helmet that had been cracked by the explosions, with several pieces even broken off. He looked around and saw his sister. He called out to her and she coughed. She was lying motionless on the ground not far from him, her arms spread out to the sides, silent. The boy realized that something was wrong with her. He began to shout loudly, calling her name. Tears sprang from his eyes again. He was in despair, but it was all in vain. He crawled over to her and began to shake her, shouting for her to wake up and get up, but the girl did not move or respond to him. She was injured. The plane turned around, circled, and approached them again. Suddenly, the girl raised her hand, stroked the boy's cheek, and wiped his tears. She asked him to go ahead and assured him that she would catch up with him, then coughed, but the boy cried out that she was lying and would not return, just like his mom and dad. The baby cried that they were all lying and asked his sister again to get up and go with him. Then he cried loudly, throwing his head back and shouting for help. Suddenly, a guy in uniform appeared in front of him. He seemed huge to the little boy. It was the guy who had pushed them away, only now he was without his helmet. He looked at the boy and said he couldn't even pretend that the child was dead because he was crying so loudly that he was practically drowning out the roar of the plane. The boy looked up at him hopefully with his huge gray eyes, from which tears continued to flow, and asked, "Are you a soldier, sir?" The guy looked down at the kid, told him to stop crying, and added that he could only save him. The child was still sitting on the ground in the rain, trying to wake his sister and watching the soldier intently. Meanwhile, the plane was approaching, flying so low and so close to them that if you wanted to, you could see the pilot. The rain continued to fall. Looking closely at the boy, the soldier said in a serious tone that what was about to happen and what the boy would see would be their secret. He raised his left hand with several fingers pointing upward, and a glow appeared. He added that if the boy told anyone, no one would believe him. Then he concentrated, and suddenly, right before their eyes, individual raindrops began to gather into larger ones. They grew and grew until they were the size of peas. The boy stared at the man without looking away. He was still crying, but he had stopped shaking his sister and was watching what the man was doing with curiosity. He saw the soldier raise his hand, join three fingers together, and then a kind of glow appeared, followed by individual raindrops gathering into larger ones. Then the soldier moved his hand, directing the drops toward the plane flying toward them, and suddenly streams of water began to rise into the air. They began to attack the flying plane. The pilot tried to shoot back, but he himself had already been hit several times by water bullets, and smoke rose from these places. These drops were even able to break through the glass of the aircraft cockpit. The pilot tried to turn away from them, but in vain, and then he realized that these were bullets made of water droplets. Despite the fact that they were indeed made of water droplets, this did not affect their destructive power, and as a result, an explosion occurred in the air. The boy looked up at the sky, which suddenly changed color, becoming lighter, and sunlight began to shine through the holes made by the bullets. The guy suggested that the boy, who was still sitting next to his sister, let her go in peace. He took the girl by the hand. She was lying with her eyes closed but smiling. At that moment, a rainbow appeared in the sky, and the guy said that the rainbow would show her the way, that his sister and parents would get there safely, and that he shouldn't worry. Still sitting on the ground, the boy looked up at the guy with his huge gray eyes, the tears already dried, and asked if he was God. Hearing the boy's question, the guy thought about how to explain it more clearly. He didn't expect to cause such an association and said no. Then the child, still looking at him hopefully, asked if he was a Tokaibi, meaning a legendary hero who had come to life and possessed eternal life. The guy thought about it, scratched his chin, and said that this option did not apply to him, that he was completely different. The boy sat on the ground, and the guy stood and seemed huge to him. The guy seriously thought about how to explain it to the child in a way that would be understandable and not reveal too much about himself. Then he smiled and said that his name was Daos. The child was very surprised. He had already calmed down and stopped crying. He was very interested in this guy and said that he was a master. The guy was glad that the kid finally understood him and knew who the Taoists were and that he had stopped crying. He smiled and said his name was Chong Wu Chi. Nowadays, the events of this story begin with an introduction to DJ Chong Wu Chi, a video blogger who eats on camera and chats with viewers. He went on air and was greeted by his viewers. His peculiarity is that he adds the particle Wu to his greetings as part of his name and image. He broadcasted from his room in front of his computer, wearing a blue tracksuit, and the first thing he asked was if everyone had a good day. Many replied that their day had been better, but some were upset that he was wearing a tracksuit again, and John Wuchi asked what was wrong with it. People started writing to him to throw away the old suit because it was full of holes, but he replied that he couldn't get rid of something that had been given to him as a gift. Some suggested it was a gift from a girl, while others wrote that they would not date him. John Wuchi stated that it was a gift from someone grateful for being saved. The audience began to say that he was mocking them and then demanded that he show his magic, and they saw that there was a spider hanging over his shoulder. Someone said that it was a tracksuit that attracted spiders, and John Wuchi pointed his index and middle fingers at the spider. In a moment, the spider was trapped in a bubble of water. The guy turned to the audience and said that there was no magic involved, just the abilities of a Taoist. Some people said it was all computer graphics, some called it magic, and there were those who recommended that he participate in the BIT talent show. Continuing to hold the spider in the trap and without lowering his fingers, the guy replied that this was not magic, but only martial arts. Suddenly, something went wrong. The guy rushed to check the camera, indignant that everything had shut down again. The camera was out of order and the spider fell onto the table. Without figuring out what had happened and without adjusting the camera, the guy was unable to go live again, and he leaned back in his chair in irritation, exhaling loudly. He would have sat there puffing with indignation, but his attention was suddenly drawn to an insistent and polyphonic demanding meow, though it was not unexpected. Chong Wu Chi turned his head toward the window and saw 3 cats sitting on the sidewalk above the room where he was sitting. He called them the 3 Musketeers. Seeing them, the guy remembered with annoyance that he was supposed to buy them food but had forgotten what he owed them, and he admitted this to them while the cats licked their lips in anticipation. He went out into the street, turned the corner, and seeing his friends told them to wait a little while. He went to find something tasty for them. Since he didn't have anything suitable for them at home, he had to go to the store, so he went as he was in his tracksuit and flip-flops. As he walked along calmly, minding his own business and thinking about what to buy for his wonderful musketeers, he was suddenly overtaken by a black foreign car. The rear window rolled down and John Wuchi asked the guy sitting in the car why he had come to see them, but the guy asked him to get in the car, adding that he had something to talk about. John Wuchi suggested they talk and said he knew why the other guy in the car had come, asking why he was still broadcasting. John Wuchi leaned over and said that people liked the show. The guy replied that he shouldn't show his magic, but John Wuchi objected, saying that otherwise he wouldn't get any likes. The guy in the car replied that he didn't understand the risks of revealing his abilities and that if he needed money, he should just say so. John Wuchi leaned toward the window and began picking his ear with his little finger. Droplets of water danced around him, which greatly annoyed the guy in the car. A moment later, John Wuchi disappeared completely, leaving behind a circle of water droplets and a huge puddle near the foreign car, with no trace of him left. The guy in the car sighed, propping his head up with his hand, and said it was just a clone and that it was strange that after living for hundreds of years, John Wuchi still hadn't grown up. At that moment, the guy was in the store, already at the checkout, with 3 cans of cat food and a sausage, the total cost of his purchase being 9 won. The guy at the register was putting his purchases into a bag and said that he recognized him and asked if he was DJ John Wuchi, as he had just watched his broadcast the other day. The guy smiled back, scratched the back of his head, thanked him, waited for his purchases to be packed, and said that it turned out he was already being recognized on the streets. Meanwhile, the cashier continued, saying that he really liked the show that John Wuchi hosted, but there was one thing that upset him, and the guy asked what it was. The cashier gathered his purchases and said that the lack of a pretty girl ruins everything and that if she appeared on the air, it could double the number of viewers. The guy thought about it, took the bag with his purchases, and already at the door said that his show was actually about Taoist skills. Leaving the store, he came face to face with a girl and immediately asked her where he could find a pretty girl in case she could give him a hint. The guy was a whole head taller than the girl, and when he looked into her huge eyes, he froze, his own pupils dilating to incredible sizes. The girl also looked at him with her huge blue eyes and, addressing him by name, said that she needed his help. Even though they were acquainted, John Wuchi did not recognize her. He continued to look at her with surprise, but still not recognizing her, he asked who she was. The girl was holding a document tube in her hands. She opened it and took out a scroll rolled up on 2 wooden sticks, asking if he recognized her now. The girl took out the scroll, which was tied with a bow in the middle and consisted of 2 connected parts, and when the guy saw it, he gasped. The girl breathed a sigh of relief when she saw his reaction and said that it was a relief for her. She asked if he remembered this thing, and he replied, of course, because it was his. Chong Wu-chi seemed happy to see the girl and that she had brought him his thing and asked with a smile how Chairman Kang was doing. The girl's face instantly became sad. She lowered her tear-filled eyes, brushed her hair away from her face, and said that Chairman Kang had died several years ago. It was clear that the girl's words had greatly upset the young man. He lowered his eyes and they too became sad in an instant, and it seemed that the boy was immersed in memories. He remembered how they had met when, after the death of his sister and parents, he had met Khan, who had saved him from death, and he was deeply saddened. They stood near the store for a while, and the girl told him what had happened to the chairman and how he had been living lately. Then they left. They walked on, continuing their conversation. The girl was dressed in an elegant suit and ballet flats, while John Wuchi walked beside her in a tracksuit and flip-flops on his bare feet. They walked past houses and shops to the boy's house, where cats were already waiting for him, and he thought about how many years had passed since Kang had left. The girl apologized to John Wuchi for not telling him about Kang's death earlier, explaining that her grandfather had always told her not to disturb him. The fact that she was Chairman Kang's granddaughter was unexpected for the guy, and he asked again if she was his granddaughter, and she replied that her name was Kang Jin-hee. They walked part of the way chatting calmly, but at a turn, they saw a monster jumping from pole to pole and both were surprised. It was huge and powerful, its eyes flashing with fire, and it constantly bared its teeth. When it saw the guy and the girl, it froze, holding on to an electric pole with its hand. Both were surprised by this encounter. The girl was silent, watching the giant in fear. Jung Wuchi asked her and himself what it was. Deciding not to linger on the pole, the monster jumped to the ground, tears streaming from its eyes, its mouth bearing huge teeth. The monster was naked. The girl covered her mouth with her hand in horror so as not to scream. John Wuchi remained calm but said that the monster looked terrible and dangerous even at first glance. Meanwhile, the monster did not hesitate. It landed on the ground, screamed, spread its clawed fingers wide, and ran towards the young people. On the way, the monster stopped and struck an electricity pole standing next to it with such force that it bent. Chong Wu-chi remained calm, but he kept his eyes on the monster, ready to repel an attack or attack himself at any moment. After dealing with the pole, the monster crouched down, leaning on the ground with its hands, and froze for a moment, looking at the young people. The monster's body was a mountain of muscles. It crouched down, still watching the young people but not moving yet. The guy covered the girl with his arm, stood in front of her, and told her not to stick her head out under any circumstances, but to stay behind him at all times. Suddenly, the monster leaped up, pushed off the ground with its feet, and rushed toward them, spreading its clawed paws to the sides, growling and baring its teeth. However, John Wuchi remained calm. He slowly put the bag of groceries on the ground and decided not to rush, but to wait until the monster came closer. The monster moved with lightning speed, but John Wuchi remained calm, thinking what a big, strong guy he was. At that moment, the monster threw its head back and growled menacingly, its eyes still burning with red flames. It bared its teeth, and for some reason, tears flowed from its eyes. Waiting for the monster to approach, John Wuchi put his left hand forward, pointing it at the monster, and energy flows swirled around it. When the monster was a few meters away from the guy, something unexpected happened. He suddenly found himself in a huge bubble of water that held him back. Having immobilized the monster in this way, John Wuchi froze the water and struck it in the head with his left hand, hoping to knock it unconscious. The ice did indeed immobilize the monster for a while, but its eyes still sparkled, its huge teeth were bared, and the monster was enraged. Chong Wuchi decided that he had dealt with the monster very easily. He yawned as if bored and reached for his phone, intending to take a picture of it. However, it wasn't that simple. The monster began to move, the ice on its face cracked, it growled, saliva flew from its mouth, and the guy was surprised. This was very unexpected for him. He continued to hold the phone in his hands but thought that the monster he had encountered was very unusual. However, apart from its head, the rest of the monster's body was encased in ice, so it continued to rage, its eyes flashing and saliva spraying in all directions. Standing in front of the monster with a bored look on his face, John Wuchi teased him, taking advantage of his immobilized position and told him to try a little harder. Suddenly, a brilliant idea came to him. He thought, why not film everything that was happening and see how many likes such a video could get him? He turned to the girl, threw her his phone, and she barely managed to catch it. He asked her if she had seen his broadcast, and she replied that yes, of course she had. Smiling, he told her to film everything in the action genre, so she needed to try to capture literally every frame. The girl was a little confused. She understood how crazy what was about to happen was, but said she would try to do everything. After settling all the issues with the filming, John Wuchi turned to the monster frozen in ice, unzipping his jacket and saying that now it was time to deal with it. Watching him, the girl tried to figure out how the broadcast was happening on his phone. She was nervous but figured it out and said everything was ready. John Wuchi began to warm up his arms and shoulders. The monster managed to free his hands and knee, but the rest of his body was still frozen in ice. However, he was surprisingly quick to free himself from the ice and, with an incredible roar, rushed towards the guy who stood calmly opposite him and simply said, "Let's go." Kang Jin-hee was able to figure out the broadcast and start the video. John Wuchi's fans soon received a notification that he had started a live broadcast. Viewers began to connect, and a monster appeared on the screen, walking towards the guy with flashing eyes. Comments flew in asking what kind of monster it was and saying that it looked like an action movie. John Wuchi stood calmly, his hands behind his back, waiting for the monster to approach and said that he was not an expert in hand-to-hand combat. In the comments, people asked if the monster was real. John Wuchi dodged the attack, jumped forward, and said that the video was a combat action genre. He added that he would try to fight alongside the viewers. At that moment, the monster leaned forward and the guy, standing above him, kicked him in the head. The monster did not expect such a trick from the guy. He howled, tears spurted from his eyes, saliva flew from his mouth, and people in the comments began to write that it was an amazing place. The monster pushed off with such force that it broke the asphalt and rushed at the guy again. The guy jumped into the air and bowed before him, holding his hands behind his back. In the comments, people asked where this was. Someone replied that John Wuchi lives in Seoul. He bent down, holding his body on his left leg, dodging the monster's blow. His right leg was free, and he struck the attacker powerfully in the chin with it, while viewers wrote in the comments that this couldn't be true and that it was all fake. The monster was surprised that the guy managed to dodge his blow and strike him back. He howled, and people in the comments discussed which area of Seoul this was happening in. Jung Woo-chi calmly brought his right leg back, standing with his hands behind his back. People discussed that he couldn't live in an expensive area. Trying to recover, the monster stood with his head thrown back. Suddenly, the guy ran up and, still holding his hands behind his back, jumped on his knee. Pushing off his knee with his right foot and left foot, he delivered another crushing blow to the head. The monster certainly did not expect such agility. John Woo-chi landed after delivering these blows and waited to see what the monster would do next, while people in the comments wrote that now, the most interesting part was about to begin. Kang Jin-hee, who was filming the broadcast on her phone, snorted, and viewers immediately began writing in the comments that they thought they heard a woman's voice. The fight continued. The monster, coming to its senses, rushed at the guy, but he pushed off with his right foot and braced his left knee against the monster's right knee. His hands remained folded behind his back. Pushing off while kneeling, he flew into the air and ended up above the monster. The comments discussed the girl. Being on top and still holding his hands behind his back, John Woo-chi kicked the monster, who fell from his height onto the asphalt, raising a cloud of dust. While the monster was struggling to get up from the ground, John Woo-chi analyzed his condition and thought that he was in pain because he hadn't used his body in a long time. The monster was not ready to lose. Coming to its senses and gathering its strength, it rushed at the guy again with incredible speed, growling and trying to scare him. While the monster was running towards the guy, the spectators were writing questions. And suddenly they saw a kitten running after a butterfly and started writing that it was in danger. The appearance of the cat came as a complete surprise to the guy. Fearing for the kitten, he even unclenched his hands, although he had not done so throughout the entire fight. And while the monster was rushing towards him, growling fiercely, he sent his clone to save the cat. He simply could not allow the animal to be harmed. After making sure that his clone had saved the kitten, John Woo-chi rushed toward the monster, throwing his left arm forward and casting a spell. They barely managed to pass each other, the guy's clone with the kitten in his arms and the monster, as the guy sent a spell of an icy spear straight into the monster's stomach. Chong Wu-chi looked at the monster and held his left hand out in front of him, from which a white light poured out, and suddenly sharp pieces of ice began to hit the monster. It roared terribly, tears and saliva still flying in all directions. It was in pain and made sounds like the grinding of metal. A few moments later, its powerful, muscular body collapsed to the ground with an incredible crash right at the boy's feet. The monster was alive. John Wu-chi thought he was amazing, moving after 6 blows with ice spears. He should be left alive and taken to the old man. Putting his hands in his pockets and leaving the monster lying on the ground, the guy turned to Kang Jin-hee and asked her if it had worked out well. She replied that it seemed so. Smiling, the guy asked for her phone and asked if he could take a look, and the girl handed him the gadget without taking her huge blue eyes off him. The broadcast was not over. Taking the phone, the guy saw that the fight was happening live, and people were still writing comments and liking it. Seeing that it was live and that a lot of people had watched it, he was horrified, and instead of being happy, he was terribly upset. Covering his face with his hand, he began to shake his head from side to side, repeating that it was a failure. The girl became worried, apparently embarrassed by the guy's reaction. She asked him what was wrong, saying that he usually did the same thing, but the guy continued to shake his head and noticed that the monster was rising from the ground. While they were reviewing the broadcast with Jeon Woo-chi, Kang Jin-hee was caught on camera and viewers saw her and began to write about what a beautiful lady she was. While they were dealing with the broadcast, Jung Woo-chi stood in front of the girl to protect her, just in case, and saw that the monster had escaped and cursed in frustration. His thoughts about the broadcast and the escaped monster were interrupted by a phone call, which was very untimely, so the guy was in no hurry to answer. The phone lit up with a call from an old man. The guy was deciding which button to press to answer the call or hang up, thinking he had messed up. After dealing with the monster, John Woo-chi went straight home. He should have returned long ago because 3 hungry cats were waiting for him at home. And so he returned home after his adventures, and the 3 musketeers finally got the chance to enjoy their food and get the long-awaited pleasure. And after eating, there's nothing better than stretching out and sleeping, which is what they were going to do, especially since it was evening and the atmosphere was conducive to it. Kang Jin-hee went with Jin Woo-chi to his house, and after dinner, the cats attacked her. One even climbed onto her lap and the girl had to pet it. Another one climbed onto Jung Woo-chi's lap, curling up, and she had to pet it too, while he silently glanced at the guy he had seen earlier that day. This guy was also present in the room, sitting on the floor in the lotus position with his hands folded in front of him and his eyes closed, looking extremely indignant. All 3 sat on the floor in silence, the only sound in the room being the purring of the cats. Each was thinking about something of their own, and no one dared to break the silence. Finally, the angry man began to scold John Woo-chi, saying that he had warned him to be careful and not to reveal himself, but he went ahead and showed the fight live. John Woo-chi began to justify himself, saying that it was just an accident and that he hadn't turned on the broadcast, but his interlocutor decided that this was no excuse. Still sitting with his arms folded across his chest, he turned to John Woo-chi and said that from the very beginning, he had been against the idea of becoming a DJ. Suddenly, behind him, the wall burst into flames so high that they almost reached the top of the door. John Woo-chi thought that Ogunyuk should be more careful. At that moment, a gray cat approached them, its eyes burning amber and reflecting the fire of the blazing wall. Behind the angry man, the fire raged, and the cat approached him. He shouted that he had lived for thousands of years, but a guy like John Woo-chi, but he didn't have time to finish. Because the gray cat approached him, lay down in front of him on the floor, put her head on his leg, and began to purr. He fell silent and looked at her in surprise. Then it sat down in front of him, placing its front paws on his legs, and looked at him intently, continuing to meow. The guy was still silent. After listening to everything the cat had to say, he picked her up and smiled. The cat stretched out her paw toward him, and John Woo-chi, who was sitting nearby, just grinned. Kang Jin-hee, who was sitting opposite them, couldn't help herself either and burst out laughing. She even covered her mouth with her hand so that no one would notice her laughing. It seemed that the angry guy understood that it was just a cunning cat trick to make him stop being angry at John Woo-chi. He grunted and coughed into his fist. He asked if the girl was Chairman Kang's granddaughter, and she replied that she was, introduced herself, and said that she had accidentally turned on the broadcast. She asked the guy not to be angry, adding that it wasn't his fault, but he stopped her with a gesture. At that moment, Jung Woo-chi called him old man. Ignoring the guy, he looked at the girl and asked what kind of help she needed. The white cat was still sitting in the girl's arms. Next to the girl lay a piece of parchment that she had shown to Jung Woo-chi. It seemed that the girl was about to tell him something, but she began to stutter. Seeing that the girl was nervous, Jung Woo-chi hurried to calm her down, saying that she didn't need to be afraid of the old man because he was much more reliable than he was. The girl replied that she didn't know how to address the guy, so he told her to call him whatever she wanted. Jung Woo-chi advised her to call him old man and smiled slyly. Kang Jin-hee laughed, and this insignificant conversation seemed to relieve all the tension in the room, and she promised to call him Senior. She picked up the scroll and said she had found them thanks to him, adding that after her grandfather's death, her family had fallen into decline. The company went bankrupt, and her father had to sell the branches and hide the family property to pay off debts and money for using cryptocurrency. She recalled the state her father was in when he had to do this, and the old man asked how he was able to find so much money if the business was ruined. Kang Jin-hee replied that there were probably those who believed him and lent him money because they saw that he had sold everything he had to pay off his loans. So their family fell into debt bondage. Her mother seemed oblivious to everything that was happening. She reassured her daughter and said that everything would be fine now. At that very moment, the girl's mother fell under the influence of a cult. She constantly reassured her daughter, saying that they had faith, but it didn't help. The guys listened attentively to the girl and they became increasingly gloomy until finally, John Woochie said that debt is terrible, but obsession with a cult is worse. The girl lowered her head, her eyes filled with tears, and said that her mother spent all her time praying and only came home once or twice a week. Finally, she put the scroll on the floor and said that after her grandfather's death, her father had not touched the scroll, but people had begun to show great interest in it. She added that many people offered a lot of money for it, and she decided to return it before her father sold it. He himself ordered it to be given to the master before it was too late. After telling this, Kang Jin-hee handed the scroll to the old man, who still had a gray cat sitting on his lap. Each of them had a cat sitting on their lap. The old man opened the scroll and said that such excitement was probably due to its content. Jung Woo-chi said the work was excellent and asked what was wrong with it. The scroll contained a drawing. The old man studied it for a while and said that it was full of pretentiousness and looked trivial. Jung Woo-chi said that the buyers were blind because they couldn't see what they were going to buy. The old man nodded thoughtfully as he continued to examine the drawing. Chong Woo-chi suddenly lost his temper, snatched the scroll from the young man's hands, and said that if he didn't like it, he would take it for himself. The young man asked if it was his work. The young man remained silent, and then the old man replied that he had doubts about it, so it was unlikely that there were people who really knew the purpose of this item. Suddenly, John Woo-chi asked who was interested in the scroll, and she replied that it was the members of the sect who had taken her mother and those who had lent money to her father. The girl looked down sadly and added that there were also those who said they would pay off her uncle's loans, and they were also interested. Then she hesitated, and the guy guessed and asked if the monster they had encountered that afternoon was also interested. But the girl replied that she knew absolutely nothing about today's monster. She had only encountered it on the way here and had never seen it before. The old man looked at Jung Woo-chi and said that first of all, he needed to find out what the scroll was, and said that the guy surely knew because he had drawn it himself. Then John Woo-chi said he would guide the old man and unfolded the scroll on the floor in front of them both so that everyone could see what was depicted on it. Then he stood up and told the old man that his inspiration was a taste of hot mocha and asked what kind of coffee the girl liked. She replied that she didn't need coffee. The guy said okay and was about to leave the room to get coffee, clearly intending to step on the scroll. When he lifted his foot and was about to step on the scroll, a funnel of energy appeared beneath him, but it was not visible from above, only from below. And when he stepped on the scroll, energy began to break through it, but the old man and the girl looked at John Woo-chi and he said he was leaving. They noticed that something was happening when the guy had already fallen into the space of the scroll, and the white cat jumped off the girl's lap and jumped towards him. All she managed to see was the top of the boy's head. The cat began to meow loudly to call him back, but everything returned to the way it was before, and the scroll became as it had been before. The girl rushed after the cat to the scroll, but it had already returned to its previous state, and she never understood what had happened. Meanwhile, the old man remained completely calm. The girl asked if it was some kind of interdimensional door, and he replied that it was possible. Although he appeared unperturbed on the outside, he also had many questions about what had happened, and he was trying to find answers. The girl was confused and discouraged. She shared that in one day she had seen more than she could have imagined in her entire life. The old man, sitting in the same unperturbed position with his arms folded across his chest, smiled, and said that there were things he had not learned even in thousands of years. His answer shocked the girl no less than everything else that was happening. Looking at him with wide eyes, she asked again, "Thousands of years? Then how old is he?" But the man did not answer. Instead, he said that if she wanted, he could ask someone to watch over her family. Not for surveillance purposes, but for protection. The girl lowered her eyes and said shyly that in her opinion, she had already caused enough problems for John Woo-chi and he was still offering help. But the old man looked at her kindly and replied that she should not worry. No matter what problems she had caused, Jong Woo-chi would surpass her 100-fold. As soon as he said this, Zhang Wuqi jumped out of the scroll, holding 2 cups of coffee in his hands, and indignantly asked if they were talking about him. As the guy climbed out of the scroll back into the room, the old man looked at him seriously and said that he was very perceptive. The guy sat down next to the old man and handed him a cup of coffee. The old man asked where the scroll came from, and the guy replied that he had created it himself. Taking the coffee and taking the first sip, the old man asked how Zhang Wuqi had created this list. He wanted to know in great detail. At that moment, the young man handed another cup of coffee to the girl sitting opposite him, turned his head toward the old man, and said carelessly that he didn't know. The old man looked away from his favorite drink and looked at the guy indignantly. After a pause, he asked if the guy was making fun of him. But Qian Wuqi just spread his arms and said that it was the truth, that he really had created it himself, but he didn't know how he had endowed it with such abilities. After that, the old man asked the next question. Did the young man have any idea who might want to get hold of this list? The young man thought for a moment. He looked at his friend seriously and at the same time somewhat confused, and honestly admitted that he had no idea who might need it. Seeing that there was no point in asking Zhang Wuqi, he began to think hard and told them they would need clues to track down those who were hunting for the scroll. Suddenly, Zhang Wuqi had what he thought was a brilliant idea, which he hastened to share with those present. They looked at him questioningly and waited. He showed them his phone and said with a big smile that the essence of his idea was to start a live broadcast and thus attract the monster. Zhang Wuqi went live, showed the fight with the monster, and announced that he was looking for the scoundrel who had destroyed everything and fled from responsibility. He showed what the monster looked like up close and asked if anyone had seen it to write in the comments. There were many comments, but none were relevant. He showed footage of the fight with the monster over and over again, urging viewers to leave comments if they had encountered it, but they doubted that it was true. The old man's assistant played his video on the internet and asked how Zhang Wuqi could have survived if he was really so powerful and scary. Meanwhile, the guy was watering flowers in his office and consulting with her about what they could do if they couldn't destroy the monster. The girl asked if he thought it was impossible to destroy the monster by separating its head and body, and the guy asked how to do that if it could change its appearance. The girl said that the moment when the monster appeared in the video had been corrected. Civilians who saw the whole wall at the scene of the fight believed it was CGI and left. She wanted to tell him that they had contacted the locals and told them to keep their mouths shut, but the guy interrupted her and asked what else she had to say. The girl checked her notes and said that he still had a meeting today with the secretary of the Ponson group, Yu Jin. She found information for him about the Kana family, who were much more influential than they thought, and she believed that the collapse of the house was a planned attack. After listening to her, the guy told her to select only those people who were related to the Qian Wuqi scroll, but the girl said they couldn't do that. This information interested the guy. He turned and asked his assistant if she wanted to say that all members of the Kang family were involved in this. She replied that it would take 6 months for the internal investigation department to obtain this information. Then she handed him a tablet and said it was a letter of approval. The guy asked if they had some thoughts about Zhang Wuqi. He began to read the letter, and the girl said that the internal affairs department thought it might be related to what he had asked about earlier. After carefully reading and signing the letter of approval, the guy thought for a moment and then said that it looked bad, but it was still unclear. Returning the tablet with the letter to his assistant, the guy said that the first thing to do was to investigate the suspicious sect that Kang Jinhee's mother had joined. The guy thought about the girl's difficult fate and how she managed to get involved with Zhang Wuqi in the first place, then suddenly looked at his phone and was surprised. Staring intently at the phone screen for a long time, he studied the information he had received and then said in surprise that he had helped her at the scene of the operation. Meanwhile, Zhang Wuqi's broadcast yielded no results, but the guy didn't sit still. He searched for the monster around the city, moving from roof to roof. Barely managing to land, he jumped again, holding his hands behind his back and clasping them together, his back completely straight, masterfully maintaining his balance. He received a phone call, answered it while wearing headphones, and was informed that all civilians within a 2-kilometer radius had been evacuated. Jumping between buildings, he marveled at how this could have been organized in the middle of the day. He was told that the area would soon be resettled and that there were few residents. Then the guy asked if it was true that there were casualties among the visitors. They told him that it was true because the lower part of the body had been completely blown apart. The guy was almost back where he first met the monster, and he ended the conversation by adding, "It doesn't matter how well you can fight if you have a lot of enemies." He jumped off the roof of the building and landed on the power line pole where he had first seen the monster, his hand still behind his back. Standing on the pole and looking at the city spreading out below, the guy thought that there was something good for monsters in a crumbling city. He put his hand to his forehead, making a kind of visor to protect himself from the sun, and began to look more closely, trying to see the monster among the buildings. Still standing on top of the pole, he was able to focus his vision so as to filter out everything unnecessary and concentrate on what he was looking for. His efforts were crowned with success. After a few minutes, he realized that he had found what he was looking for, and the distance to his target was about 70 meters. But instead of one monster, he saw two and thought that compared to them, the previous one looked like a gentleman and noticed that the monsters were looking for something. He decided it was time to go down, so he took a step forward and jumped off the pole onto the ground, still keeping his balance and keeping his hands behind his back. He landed with incredible ease and grace, landing on his left foot and then carefully placing his right foot on the ground. After landing, he walked toward the monsters with a broad smile, completely calm and confident, telling himself that he needed to check what the monsters were looking for. The monsters did not seem to notice him and continued to explore the area, seemingly searching for something within the area where the young man had spotted them. Chang Wuqi approached them, wondering why the monsters weren't attacking him since he was so close, and suddenly realized that they couldn't sense him. This realization made the guy think. The previous monster had sensed him immediately and rushed to attack, but another thought crossed his mind. Coming even closer to them, the guy saw that the monsters were in some kind of translucent sphere, which meant they could only move within it. He realized that they were surrounded by some kind of field, and it was because of this field that they couldn't see him, and it seemed that they were just moving around in one place looking for something. This was unexpected for him, and he was surprised to note that even he could sense the field surrounding them only by concentrating hard. The next moment, the guy felt that he was not alone here and asked the person approaching him from behind if this field was his doing. A young man with light hair and a light-colored suit did indeed approach Chang Wuqi from behind, but he was in no hurry to answer the question. He waited until the guy turned to him and then asked if he was talking about the field. It was indeed his work. It blocked out sounds and vision. Having said all this, the guy decided it was time to greet Chang Wuqi. He smiled slightly and asked if they could have lunch together. However, Chang Wuqi stood silently, looking at the guy and not answering him. It was clear from his face that he was thinking and trying to understand something for himself. The guy, a little confused, replied that he had heard somewhere that it was customary to introduce oneself in this way in this country and asked if he had done something wrong. Chang Wuqi replied that this was true, but that this was not the situation at the moment, and thought that perhaps the guy was a foreigner who had not heard that another one had joined them. It seemed that the blonde man had heard Chang Wuqi's thoughts or read them on his face, so he said that the guy seemed interested in who he was and called him by name. They stood facing each other, the blonde with his hands behind his back and Chang Wuqi with his hands in his pockets, and asked how he knew him. He replied that he had seen his stream. The monsters were still in the transparent sphere, and the blonde man added that he was a fan of Chang Wuqi and wanted to see the guy deal with the monsters in person. Chang Wuqi asked in surprise what he meant, and the blonde man replied that he shouldn't worry, that he could get rid of them neatly from here. He touched the gold-plated watch on his wrist, pressed something on it, then winked at Chang Wuqi and added that one of the monsters was on him. Following the blonde man's actions, the guy turned to the monsters and noted to himself that the field holding the monsters was beginning to break down. The field began to crumble from the top of the dome, and it seemed that this contributed to the monsters beginning to sense Chang Wuqi's presence. They began to growl and bare their huge teeth, but the guy calmly turned his head and asked why they were staring at him and called them names. The sphere was almost destroyed, and the monsters were eager to attack the guy. They were already frantic, tears streaming from their eyes and saliva spraying in all directions. When the sphere collapsed, the monsters rushed forward, trying to outrun each other. Chang Wuqi stood calmly, reminding the blonde man of their agreement that he would take one. The guy looked at the blonde standing in front of him, and suddenly he disappeared in a second. The guy only had time to wonder where he had gone when the monster was already in flight. And at the moment when the monster jumped on him, raising its huge paw to strike, the guy jumped up, keeping his hands in his pockets, thinking, oh well. The monster's huge paw crashed into the asphalt, which began to break into pieces and fly into the air. It was on one of these fragments that Chang Wuqi landed with his foot. Leaning on this piece, he reached out with his other foot and kicked the monster right in the head before it had time to recover from the previous blow. Chang Wuqi remained calm and unperturbed, only taking his hands out of his pockets to make his turn in the air more mobile and comfortable. After completing the turn, the guy slowly landed on the ground next to the monster that had collapsed on the ground. He was a mass of muscles, so he smashed the asphalt beneath him. While one monster was lying on the ground, another one had already managed to run up to Chang Wuqi. It was no less huge and also bared its teeth, growled, and spat. It had a long mane and long arms with claws which it stretched out toward the guy, but he leaned back, keeping his balance, and avoided the blow. At the same time, the guy had time to think that this monster was quite fast despite its enormous height and size, and he didn't like it at all. He crouched down and jumped back from the spot where the first monster had attacked him, thinking that these monsters were much stronger than the previous one. A brilliant idea came to his mind. He decided that the monsters should be separated first so it would be easier to fight them, and he started to run. They chased after him, and the guy suddenly jumped up sharply near the building, his hand still behind his back. The four-armed monster rushed after him. The guy ran along the wall, pushing off from it even though it was vertical. The monster kept up with him, aided by its four-clawed arms and tenacious legs. Another green monster remained on the ground, raising its head to watch them, and the guy thought that with its huge fists, it couldn't keep up with them. But just as he thought that, the monster threw back its head and roared so fiercely and so loudly that its roar could probably be heard throughout the city. When the roar sounded, the guy was already on the roof and didn't hesitate. Literally a few moments later, the four-armed monster was on the roof. Without thinking twice, Chong Wuchi rushed forward, jumping from building to building, leading the four-armed monster away from his companion with the huge fists. He had a slight advantage, having reached the roof first, so he jumped to the neighboring building, also staying ahead of the monster for a few seconds. However, the monster was not far behind. It tried not to lose sight of the boy, growling and waving its arms, trying to close the distance between them as quickly as possible. On one of the roofs, Cheon Wuchi decided to jump down instead of running further, and the monster immediately rushed after him, clinging to the walls of the building with its huge claws. Its huge mane fluttered, its eyes burned with fire, tears flowed from its eyes, saliva splattered in all directions, its teeth were clenched tightly, and the monster growled angrily. Jumping down, Cheon Wuchi flew backwards, and when he saw that the monster was jumping after him without hesitation, the guy raised his hands to cast a spell. Stretching out his right hand, he conjured an icy spear, and immediately small but sharp icy spears rushed at the monster from all sides. However, completely unexpectedly, the monster began to catch them with both hands, continuing to cling to the building and balcony ledges while catching the spears with the other two. By this time, Cheon Wuchi was standing on the ground, watching the monster's actions in surprise. The guy was clearly not prepared for it to be so intelligent. Meanwhile, the monster, holding the ice spears in its hands, approached the ground, moving very quickly and nimbly despite its size. Seeing that his spear trick had not produced the desired result, the boy raised his left hand and began to cast a new spell. The ice spears disappeared, and drops of water began to materialize in the air, gathering from small drops into large ones and increasing in size. A glow appeared around the guy's left hand as he continued to hold it with his fingers spread apart. The drops became larger, and they all grew in size. Then they froze and turned into pieces of ice. John Wuchi threw his right hand up and cast a spell to turn the ice into buckshot. Immediately, they rushed upward in a powerful stream to neutralize the monster, but seeing what was happening, it pushed off from the building and jumped forward. Flying forward a little to avoid the hail of bullets that could harm it, the monster rushed down, spreading its arms and heading straight for the guy. This time, John Wuchi did not have time to react. The monster grabbed him by the head with one hand and squeezed tightly, causing the young man to lean back. But then something happened that the monster could not have expected. The guy's body suddenly dissolved under its hand, first into a body and then into water. When the monster landed on the ground, instead of the guy he had just safely grabbed, there was a huge puddle of water on the ground, and the monster roared. He began to look around in search of his opponent, sniffing, hoping to detect him by smell, and even got down on all fours. He had no idea that John Wuchi was watching him from the roof of a neighboring building, his arms folded across his chest, thinking about how fast he was catching spears. The guy thought with disappointment that he would hardly be able to take this monster alive, and became even more upset, thinking that he would have to apologize to the old man for this. Turning his head, he saw a blond man standing on the neighboring roof with his arms folded behind his back and asked if John Wuchi was having fun. Chong Wuchi decided that he was joking, so he grimaced in response and indignantly asked if the blond man was mocking him. The blond man scratched his ear thoughtfully and replied, asking if the guy was deliberately not using advanced techniques that could kill monsters. Then he suddenly thought about the question and said meaningfully, "Or," and then added that perhaps these techniques were the limit of his abilities. Chong Wuchi folded his arms across his chest and said indifferently that the reason was that he had simply been asked to capture the monsters alive if possible. Hearing this, the blonde asked why, to which the guy replied even more indifferently that he didn't know, perhaps to come up with countermeasures against the monsters. The blonde man replied calmly that he had the impression that there was a special organization in their country for this purpose. Chong Wuchi asked him if it was the same in other countries, and the guy, still propping his chin with his left hand, replied that it all depended on the place. Then, squinting and cupping his chin with his fingers, he said calmly that Chong Wuchi should be more careful. Chong Wuchi stood with his arms folded across his chest, looking calm when the four-armed monster reappeared in front of him, growling and ready to pounce on him. It swung its huge paws, and just as it was about to grab John Wuchi, the guy stood on the edge of the roof and jumped down. The monster had to turn around and rush after him. The guy seemed to be running up a vertical wall, and the monster crawled after him, clinging to the walls of the building. Then the monster pushed off the wall with all its might and made a huge leap, closing the distance between them and getting very close to the guy. It swung its huge hands at the guy again and was about to grab him, but the guy leaned back, bending his legs, and the monster was left empty-handed again. The monster flew past him, the guy took a few steps along the wall and ended up on the roof, and at that very moment, without wasting any time, began to cast a spell. The monster also ended up on the roof, but he was below the guy, who continued to wave his hands, energy swirling around them, and cast the spell. As a result of the spell, an icy spear was created, with which the guy wounded the monster. The monster fell onto the roof, and the water beneath him froze, but the guy wasn't done yet. The monster lay on a pile of ice and tried to pull the icicle sticking out of his back with his hands, while the guy continued to create a new ice spear. Using all four hands and all his strength, the monster managed to break the ice spear he had fallen on, even though it was very thick. He had already begun to slowly get to his feet. Cheon Wuchi stood with his right hand raised, and suddenly a hail of sharp ice spears rained down from above. But that wasn't all. Focusing and clenching his right hand into a fist, the guy cast an ice lightning spell, and everything around him sparkled. The monster did not have time to get to its feet. In addition to the ice spears flying from the sky, there was also a rain of lightning bolts flashing and darting back and forth. It seemed as if powerful streams of water mixed with ice spears were pouring from the sky, and as soon as they reached the surface of the roof, they began to freeze. Soon, the entire roof was covered with ice spears, and the water that fell from the sky also froze, taking the form of sharp ice spears. Then the stream of rain and ice spears stopped abruptly. The guy remained unharmed, standing on the edge of the roof, watching as the monster became covered in ice. When it was all over, he silently looked at the place where the monster had been lying and thought that it seemed like it was time for him to go to heaven and be reborn. A few moments later, when the ice melted, John Wuchi saw that the monster had disappeared, leaving only a huge dark green puddle in its place. It smelled awful, so unpleasant and pungent that Jian Wuchi had to cover his nose with his hand to keep from feeling sick. At that moment, the blonde man who had been on the neighboring roof suddenly appeared next to the guy and asked if it was his first time smelling something like that, even grimacing. He grinned as he approached the guy and said that he himself already had quite a lot of experience with monsters and that this was a completely different area. Chong Wuchi, still covering his nose and mouth with his hand and trying not to breathe in the smell coming from the disgusting puddle, asked what this other area was. Instead of answering, the blonde guy started applauding him, saying that the spectacle was just what he needed, and added that not long ago it had seemed like a real illusion to the guy. Chong Wuchi cheekily replied that the blonde guy said he was glad to meet him and that he had such skills, but the guy replied that he didn't want anything to do with him. The blonde man moved towards the guy and either accidentally or on purpose stepped into the puddle left by the monster. John Wuchi thought he would have to spend a fortune on dry cleaning. However, the blonde guy didn't even seem to notice that he was standing in a puddle of foul-smelling liquid. Instead, he held out his right hand to the guy, introducing himself. The blonde man was holding a business card in his hand, which he was now handing to the guy, and as he had promised, it stated who he was and what he did. Chong Wuchi took the business card in his hand and began to examine it. He read that it said Merlin the Magician, Illusionist, and included a contact phone number. After reading the information on the card, the guy began to shake it in front of him, asking again if he was just an illusionist. That is, just a magician? To which Merlin calmly replied with a smile that this was indeed the case and that he was very sorry that he had not had the opportunity to show the guy everything he was capable of. Chong Wuchi listened attentively to the blonde man, his hands in his pockets, thinking that he didn't like something about this guy, but he couldn't figure out what it was yet. Hearing Merlin's words that he had failed to show his abilities, he suggested that he deal with another monster. The magician turned around and asked him. They both looked down where a huge green monster with huge fists was waiting for them. He was eager to get revenge, including for his comrade. Merlin smiled and said that he had indeed forgotten about the second monster. Chong Wuchi thoughtfully bowed his head and waited for the mage's answer. Merlin slowly raised his hand, snapped his fingers, and waves of energy swirled around him. He said he could easily deal with this monster. The monster was tired of waiting. The longer he had to wait, the stronger his anger grew and the more ferocious he became, growling incessantly. Merlin straightened his right arm and continued snapping his fingers, beginning to cast a spell while casually putting his other hand in his trouser pocket. The guys watched the monster standing on the roof. After a few moments of magic, the monster lost its head. John Wuchi was surprised and asked how the magician did it. Merlin replied that he couldn't say yet, and that it would be great if his abilities could be recognized instantly, just like John Wuchi's skills. Seeing the guy's confusion, Merlin said that instead he would tell him something else and added that monsters were a failed experiment. Chong Wuchi asked if these failures meant that there were successes, and Merlin replied that he did not have such information, but he had seen something similar in another country. He seemed to return to those events and said that it happened in Ireland. In one day, a village where people peacefully raised sheep disappeared from the map. Hearing the unfamiliar name, the guy rolled it around on his tongue, tried to pronounce it, and then thoughtfully asked Merlin where it was located. Without waiting for an answer, he asked the next question that interested him much more. If the village had disappeared, how did the wizard himself survive? Touching his watch on his left hand, Merlin said that, as the boy had probably already noticed, he had the ability to hide his body. He added that he could do this for as long as necessary and had done so even when the village collapsed and was buried underground. Hearing this, John Wuchi was outraged and replied that he should have told everyone the news, but the magician said that people would have thought he was crazy after that. The young man stared silently at the illusionist for a few seconds, trying to comprehend what he had heard, until he finally asked if he had simply left people to die. The magician replied that he was weaker than he seemed and had begun an investigation. If it had been done on purpose, the organizer should not start destroying everything indiscriminately. He added that he had researched the monsters, which he had learned about from people who had escaped from there and were tired of suffering, but he had not asked the monsters who had ordered the attack. He concluded his story by saying that he did what he could at the time and then forgot about everything and did not encounter anything similar until he learned about it. The guy was surprised that the magician had found out about him from somewhere, so he asked where, and the magician replied that it was from recommendations. He had just posted a new video on his channel. He filled the live stream while the guy was fighting the monster and said he couldn't believe he would see something like this in Asia, especially on a broadcast, and said he was the same. He looked intently into the guy's eyes and said that an ordinary person was not capable of such a thing, but the guy cheekily replied that he didn't want to get involved with him. Merlin leaned on the railing and said that maybe someone was conducting new tests now, that he might have missed something, but he didn't have any thoughts yet. Chong Wuchi asked how he could have no ideas when he knew so much about monsters, and the mage replied that all monsters are completely different and their abilities are also different. The more the guy listened to him, the more questions he had for the mage. He couldn't understand why the mage was saying he knew some things, but not others. He thought about it, not that he wasn't interested in monsters, but research and mass production were different approaches, and if something went wrong, there would be trouble. Seeing that the guy was lost in thought, Merlin decided to distract him, saying that he had already told him everything he needed to know and would like to get answers to his questions. Looking at the birds chirping on the wires, Cheon Wuchi told Merlin that he hadn't told him about their lair yet, but the magician replied that he didn't know himself and didn't want to lie. In response, the magician asked him how the guy managed to change his location and added that he didn't think it could be levitation. The young man wanted to say that he should not talk about his abilities. Then he decided to ask Merlin a question. Perhaps he was also interested in the scroll. Hearing the boy's question about the scroll, Merlin asked again what scroll he was talking about. It seemed that he was really hearing about the scroll for the first time. Chong Wuchi snapped his fingers, and behind him, the scroll unfolded. It looked like a black rectangle as tall as him. He pointed at it and said so. After showing Merlin the scroll, the guy watched him closely, waiting to see any reaction on his face that would give him a clue. However, Merlin showed no visible interest in the scroll. He looked at the guy with a direct, open gaze, which aroused suspicion. He became curious about what was behind the guy's back, leaned over to look, and said, "Maybe it's for moving between dimensions," and replied, "No, I don't think so." Then he looked up at the guy with eyes that clearly showed surprise, admiration, and interest, and asked how he did it. Still holding the scroll open, Cheon Wuchi meaningfully raised his index finger and said, "No," adding that he would remain silent. He looked at the mage, trying to remember his answer when he asked about the monster, and added that they were not close enough yet, which seemed to be what he meant. When the fight with the monsters was over, John Wuchi went home and went on the air. It lasted more than an hour, and people discussed what had happened in the comments. While the guy was opening a can of soda, those who had just joined the broadcast asked what had happened, and those who had been there from the beginning explained and gave their assessment. When the can was finally open, John Wuchi took a few sips with relish, continuing to follow what viewers were writing in the comments. Having quenched his thirst, the guy put the soda can on the table and said he had planned to explain everything to them, but they had already jumped to conclusions. He added that one person couldn't do anything and asked if they knew how many research centers there were in Korea. People started writing that they knew. Putting his foot on the chair, the guy told them to get it out of their heads and added that the girl who was recording last time was in danger. People began to ask who the girl was. Assuming that the producer and the guy asked what was wrong, why was it strange for them that someone could stream with him? He started to get angry at the commenters, his left hand began to shake, and he said that none of it mattered, that he couldn't come to their house to calm them down. People wrote that they wanted to take a photo with him. Someone wrote that he had his own CGI team, but the guy got upset and started saying that it wasn't true. Someone wrote that the atmosphere on the air today was completely crazy, and John Wuchie clearly agreed with him. Everything today was somehow not going according to plan. Suddenly, someone in the comments asked if he had a video with the informant, and others picked up on it and started writing that yes, they needed the video. John Wuchie was already getting seriously angry, fed up with these empty questions. He grabbed the table and someone wrote, "Look, he's going to hit the table." Instead of hitting it, the guy raised his hand to a can of soda and the liquid inside began to rise. People started writing and asking what it was. Meanwhile, the drink kept rising and began to take the form of a monster made of liquid. People started writing that it was a hologram. The angry guy showed them this monster made of soda. He held it with his hand and told them to look, saying that this is what they call a zombie. With his other hand, the guy began to create a second figure out of the liquid, saying that this was the one who told him that zombies were a failed experiment. In the blink of an eye, he formed a person out of the water who looked exactly like Merlin. People wrote with admiration that the modeling was magnificent. Suddenly, he saw someone ask in the comments if the second figure was Merlin, and the guy asked if the commenter knew him. People began to respond that of course they knew him, because he was the famous wizard, the white magician Merlin, who had taken over Ixid that day. The guy heard about Ixid for the first time, was surprised, and asked the commenters to explain what Ixid was. Someone wrote that the guy should Google it. The figures on the table remained standing without his help, and he scratched his head and asked how it was read. Someone was able to explain that Ixid is an Anglo-American streaming platform where streamers are invited and they have a prize fund. Someone remembered that the winner of the first season was an adventurer and was given access to dangerous places, so they also gave him all the necessary equipment. Chong Wuchie suddenly became noticeably sad, threw the little man from the soda can off the table right onto his trowel and said, "So that's how it is." Then, pointing his index finger at the second figure of Merlin the wizard and preparing to knock it off, he asked if the winner was a foreigner. People replied that this was indeed the case and warned him that if he started advertising Ixid, he would be banned from the platform where he posted his videos. Annoyed, he threw both figures off the table, splashing his tracksuit, and said, "Well, okay," but they asked him to show them something else. Completely saddened by the bad news, John Wuchie sat with his cheek propped up on his hand and asked in a hopeless tone what exactly they wanted him to show. His mood changed dramatically and he asked if they really wanted to see him. Someone replied that they wanted to meet not him, but the female producer. Someone else in the comments advised him to go on a tour around the country and show it in his videos. The guy latched onto this idea and thought about it for a moment. Then he leaned over as if trying to find something under the table, stuck out his tongue, tilted his head, winked, and seemed to be about to do something mischievous. Smiling, he took his scroll from under the table, showed it to the camera, and said that he had something else very interesting for them today. Then he got up from his chair, walked over to the door, unfolded his scroll completely so that everyone could see it, and showed it to the audience. Smiling, he asked them to write in the comments where in Korea they would like to go. Someone wrote that they would like to go to the moon. People didn't understand what was going on and why the guy had taken out the scroll and was asking such questions, but he asked the commenters to be more serious. In the next comment, someone wrote that they would like to go to the top of the Namsan Tower. John Wuchie replied that there was no place he couldn't go. People started writing in the comments that it was all a lie, that the guy was deceiving them, but he put the scroll on the floor and picked up his phone to show them everything. Then he turned the phone camera on himself and smiled, saying that they shouldn't ask him to do that on the next stream. Someone wrote, "Come on already." 7,500 viewers froze in anticipation as the guy lifted his foot over the scroll spread out in the middle of the room. The guy stepped on it and fell through. Everyone saw the glowing rectangle of the scroll lying on the floor and the magical space where the guy had fallen. Sitting in front of their computers, viewers couldn't believe that this was really happening. The broadcast continued, and there was no doubt that this was real. Right in mid-flight, John Wuchie smiled, turned the camera towards himself, and asked if everything was okay, if the broadcast had stopped, and if anyone was writing that they were scared. The flight continued, and the guy kept filming everything around him. He was still in the magical space and said they had to wait a little longer. A few minutes after he stepped on the scroll, he was about to land and happily said, "The top of the Namsan Tower, just as they wanted." However, something went wrong. The guy was indeed flying towards the tower, but the trajectory of his flight shifted slightly, and he was not supposed to land on the tower. Since the broadcast was still ongoing, viewers saw his eyes wide with horror and his hair blowing in the wind, and they could clearly hear his piercing screams. The guy was flying down. Someone wrote admiringly that he was flying. Someone asked if he was falling by accident, and the guy was getting closer and closer to the ground. The viewers watched the broadcast and his movements without looking away, and the guy flew down without slowing down, thinking that it wouldn't be long before he died. Since the broadcast was still going on, John Wuchi wanted everything to end spectacularly and the viewers to be impressed, so he began to ask, "Come on, open up faster." At that moment, he addressed his scroll, asking it to open in the right place so that he could land safely. The scroll safely opened right in front of him, and John Wuchi breathed a sigh of relief, not forgetting to film everything that was happening on camera. A few moments later, he safely fell into the rectangle of the scroll and found himself back in the magical space. When he met Merlin and showed him the scroll, Merlin asked if it had accidentally come from there with Mr. Monster. The guy replied that it definitely hadn't because he had made the scroll himself, which surprised the magician quite a bit. He asked if it was really him and how he had done it. Chong Wu-chi thought for a moment and replied that he himself did not know the answer to that question, as he had only managed to do it once in 500 years. Then Merlin told him that it was not some kind of unique ability, but an artifact, and that he might agree to sell it for a decent amount of money. The young man replied without hesitation that the answer was no, and the magician asked what he thought about a commission for producing similar artifacts. Chong Wu-chi said he wasn't interested. Lately, there had been a lot of people curious about the scroll, and he raised his fingers to get him to focus. Looking at the mage, he said that he had encountered the first monster after using the scroll, and if the mage knew anything, the guy would share the secret of how to make it. The mage closed his eyes regretfully and said that he had encountered this artifact for the first time, so he had nothing to say, but if he found out anything, he would pass it on to him. Chong Wu-chi remained silent in response to the remark, thinking to himself that if he managed to get information from even one piece of paper, he would be grateful. As he flew to the tower, he had time to think that with the help of the scroll, he could go anywhere, but now he could not leave Korea. He also thought that he could try to go somewhere further away, but that would be very risky because it could cause complications with the subspace. As he approached the room, he thought that if an ordinary person picked up the scroll, nothing would happen to them, but someone like him could get lost in space. Finding himself in his room and unprepared for landing, he fell face down on the floor and wondered why everyone was so eager to get their hands on this scroll. The next day, Kang Jin-hee dragged him outside. The guy walked reluctantly, looking miserable, whining the whole way that he didn't want to go anywhere. But the girl was adamant. She looked at him with a smile and said that the old man had said it was necessary, and the boy couldn't deny it, so they had to go. Jong Woo-chi was forced to admit that the old man had indeed told him to go. He looked at the girl and said that her outfit had given him strength. As they walked down the street, the men sitting in the cafe turned to look at the girl, but she was embarrassed by the boy's words and said he was flattering her. She really was very beautiful today, and even Jung Woo-chi couldn't help it himself and said that it was very pleasant to have a bright young girl by his side. He was wearing a tracksuit and flip-flops and said he had called her to come with him, so there might not be enough salt today. The girl asked again, and he confirmed it. As they walked, the girl asked what the old man did for a living, and the guy replied that he was the chairman of the Ponzin Real Estate Corporation Group. Hearing this, the girl picked up her bag and suddenly exclaimed indignantly that if that was the case, she should have brought something else instead of a roll. Chong Woo-chi did not understand her reaction to the information about the old man and the gift and asked what she should have brought. The girl replied that she should have brought something alcoholic. After listening to her, the guy laughed sincerely and waved his hand, saying that people like them just need to breathe and she should get it out of her head. In response, Kang Jin-hee asked in surprise if there were others like them. The guy replied that of course there were, and the girl asked how many there were. The guy said there were many, and the whole world would know about them, but the master keeps Korea closed. The girl asked if it was probably so that people wouldn't find out about the others. The guy replied that he probably thinks that if people like him start walking around the world, innocent people could get hurt, so it's important to prevent harm. So they walked and talked until they came across a white foreign car parked near the sidewalk. As they passed by, Jong Woo-chi looked at it. When they reached the car, a tall girl in a white suit with short hair suddenly got out of it. It was the old man's secretary. She greeted the young people, and Jong Woo-chi asked if she was from the Yu family because her face looked familiar. The girl introduced herself. She said her name was Yu Jin-ah and that she was the secretary of the chairman of the Ponson Group of Companies. The guy replied that their family had had the same face for the last 500 years. However, the assistant did not respond to his remark. She greeted Kang Jin-hee, and the guy asked if it seemed like generations had been taught to dislike him. She opened the back door of the car, bowed, and said she had heard many stories about him as a child, that she was not ignoring him, and invited him to sit down. Jung Woo-chi and Kang Jin-hee sat in the back seats of the car, and after a while, the foreign car took them to the Tangung residence. As soon as they entered, Yoojin grabbed a bowl of salt and started throwing it at Jung Woo-chi. He shouted that they hadn't seen each other in so long, and she immediately started throwing things at him.